Hello and welcome to Timeless Truths, a sermon podcast from St. Mark Ministries in Greater Green Bay, Wisconsin. This episode we continue our series, His Final Steps. In episode 41, let's join Brandon Steenbock for a special Maundy Thursday episode, and we learn how his final steps led to the upper room. So open up your heart, open up your Bible, and let's dig into these timeless truths.
So why was I invited to come and speak to you? After all, I was just a servant in my master's household. He actually knew Jesus better than I did. In fact, it was his upper room where Jesus and his disciples got to celebrate the Passover. But I was just a servant there. I wasn't really a follower of Jesus until I'd seen him risen from the dead. But I was asked to come and maybe explain to you, why is it that I, a Jewish man, no longer celebrate the Passover? Seems kind of strange, right? I mean, apart from the Sabbath, there's really nothing that is more essentially Jewish than to celebrate that Passover year after year in the spring. And yet, I've found that Jesus has given something that is so much better. And to explain that, I need to start by just giving you a little recap of what the Passover was all about, why we had it in the first place. Maybe you know the story, how the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and how Moses had been sent by God to appeal to Pharaoh for our freedom. And of course, Pharaoh, not wanting to let go of his source of free labor, said, "No, I'm not going to have any of that. You can't have their freedom." And God knew that Pharaoh's heart was going to be hard, and so he had a plan, the plagues. And one after another, 9 times over, he sent a plague saying, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "No, I won't let them go." And so God had to send the 10th plague, the worst plague, the plague of the death of the firstborn, where the angel of death would come throughout the whole land of Egypt, and the firstborn son of every home in all of Egypt would be claimed by the angel of death, would die. Unless the family had painted on the doorframe of their house the blood of a lamb, showing that they had made a sacrifice of a lamb in place of their firstborn, to redeem their firstborn child. Because, see, sin has a price, and redemption is costly, and God demanded a sacrifice. It seems a little brutal, honestly, if you think about it, right? But you have to understand that God was going to war for us. The nation of Egypt, they were the superpower, the military powerhouse, and the strength of their army really was in the fact that every generation, new sons were raised up into that army. And well, if they had let us go, even if we had been able to escape and had our freedom for a little while, Egypt would have kept coming after us. And so God had to break their strength, not just then, but for an entire generation to come. And so as brutal as it sounds, it was necessary for God to do this, to send this angel of death. But I'll be honest, sometimes I recoil a little bit at the idea. I mean, it does seem kind of awful that this angel of death would come to the homes and take the life of the firstborn child, the firstborn son, a child. Does he really deserve that? Well, actually, I've thought about that question a lot. What I've come to realize is that I'm disturbed by it because I don't understand how deep and pervasive and corrupting sin actually is. I don't realize how widespread it is. But God does. God knows that every child, Egyptian, Israelite, everyone else, has been born completely corrupted by sin and in need of redemption. And actually that Passover, the idea of being able to paint the blood and the angel of death would pass over, is actually God's mercy in action. Because he's giving a sacrifice to redeem the firstborn. Saying your firstborn needs to be redeemed, here's a way to do so. And that wasn't just for us Israelites. You know, if an Egyptian family had listened to that and said, yeah, you know what, we're going to believe in your God and we're going to paint the blood of a lamb on our doorposts, their firstborn son would be spared as well. And actually some Egyptian families did. In fact, the story goes that there were even some Egyptian families who followed us out of Egypt when we left, because we did get to leave. God used this Passover to free us from slavery, and then he commanded that we would celebrate it year after year so that we would remember. So we would remember that God keeps his promises, that we would remember that God is greater than any nation or any king. We would remember that God had rescued us from slavery, that he had given us hope and a future. But it wasn't just for us to look back. It wasn't just a meal of commemoration to look back on something. It was also pointing us forward. And I don't think I really understood that when I was a kid. My dad would take me out and we would take the lamb and we would sacrifice the lamb. And he would talk about how our forefathers had done so to get freedom from Egypt. And I didn't realize at the time the lesson God was teaching with that. That every time we killed that lamb, we were being reminded that sin has a price. Redemption is costly. This sacrifice stands in place of us. But it also points forward to something, because see, we've sacrificed a lot of lambs. Every family, every year, again and again and again. And you know what? Sin is still a thing. Death is still real. And so this sacrifice can only point forward to the greater sacrifice that God was going to make. I've wondered sometimes, in the years since Jesus' death and his resurrection, I've thought back, when Jesus was growing up as a little boy, he was a Jewish kid, he grew up in a Jewish family, when his dad took him out and they sacrificed a lamb, did he think to himself, that's me? Did he see himself in that sacrifice? After all, his cousin John called him the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Did he think about that on the night that he was celebrating with his disciples? I'll talk about that night that he was celebrating with his disciples. I was there. As I said, it was my master's house, my master's upper room, and I was there to serve. And maybe you don't realize this, but in Jerusalem, we kind of had this law. See, God had said that you had to celebrate the Passover within the walls of Jerusalem. You had to do it in the city. And so wherever you were from other cities or towns, you had to come to Jerusalem and celebrate there. And if you didn't own a house, well, where are you going to do this? Well, that was why we had this law. If you owned a house in Jerusalem and you had space, you had to let a traveler celebrate the Passover in your house. If they came and asked, and you had the space, yep, you can use it. But my master, he didn't just let Jesus use his house out of obligation. No, he had been following Jesus for some time, and so for him it was an honor. It was a privilege. Yes, Jesus, of course you can use my house. But something else you got to understand, Jesus was a wanted man at this time. The leaders, they were trying to find a way to trap Jesus, arrest him, and get rid of him. And what better time than when everybody's closed up in their houses having this meal, right? The streets are empty. All they had to do was figure out where Jesus is going to celebrate the Passover, spring a trap, get him out of there, real quiet-like. And Jesus wasn't going to let that happen, so he worked out a plan with my master so that they could celebrate the Passover in secret. Now, that plan included having a little signal to the disciples for who to talk to so that nobody would be following them, so that they would know where to go. And, that's kind of where I come in. And I'm going to be honest, it was a little bit, degrading. See, the plan was that I would take a water jar and I would go out and walk through the streets. I know, right? Me, a man, carrying a water jar out in the street? That's a woman's job. No man would be caught dead carrying a water jar out in the streets of Jerusalem. Well, maybe that doesn't make as much sense to you and your culture today, but for me, it was really humiliating. But I loved my master, and I wanted to do what he asked. So I did it. And actually, I have to admit, it was actually a pretty clever plan, because I think anybody who saw me would have assumed that my master was purposely humiliating me, that he was punishing me for something, and they would just look away, which makes the perfect ruse. While Peter and John came up to me and like, hey, you're the guy. Where are we going to celebrate the Passover? And I could say, yeah, come on, let me show you. And nobody would be any the wiser. At the time, it didn't really occur to me, but it has since then, that now that I know who Jesus actually is, that the same God who planned out this Passover celebration to be this symbol pointing forward to his sacrifice, also planned very carefully to celebrate his Passover meal with his disciples. It's almost like he's a God who likes to plan things. I think that's cool. Well, anyway, that night when they came to our house to celebrate the Passover, my role was simple. It was help out where you're needed and otherwise just stay out of the way, which I thought was kind of strange. I'm a servant. I'm supposed to be there to help. But I didn't know then what I know now, what was going to happen that night and how important it was that Jesus had privacy with his disciples to celebrate together, how important that would be for them to have that time. But I just followed instructions. I was there. I was ready to help. And as they came in, I was ready to do the foot washing. That's my job, after all. And when Jesus kind of waved me down, like, no, you're not going to do this, I'm going to be honest, I was a little insulted. It's like, what, am I not good enough to do the foot washing? This is my job, after all. But then when Jesus took off his outer garment and he got down on his knees and he started washing everyone's feet, it's like I realized that I was wrong about what service means. That it's not about doing what you have to do because you're told to do it, no matter how dirty the job is. Service is about lovingly doing whatever is necessary to care for the people that you love. But, that wasn't the part of the night that made the biggest difference for me. Nor was it the part of the night where I realized Jesus really does know things that nobody else could know. When he called out the disciple who was going to betray him, when he called him out by name, it's going to be you, Judas. And Judas was like, what, not me? And then he got up and he stormed out of the room. And the other disciples were like, they weren't sure what was going on. I wasn't sure what was going on. It was kind of awkward for everybody. It's kind of tense. But that moment passed. And what really started to change my whole life was later. After they had eaten, they had done the whole ceremony parts, and then they ate the meal. And then I was supposed to step in and just help out, say, you need anything else before they finish up with the ceremony? But as I was coming into the room, something told me to stop. And so I did, right in the doorway. Standing there in the shadows. And I watched. And I listened. As Jesus took bread and he broke it, he gave it to his disciples saying, take and eat, this is my body. And they ate. And then he took a cup and he passed it around and said, take and drink, this is my blood which is poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. And they took and they drank. And I can't really explain this to you in ways maybe that you can fully understand, but all I can say is that when I heard him say those words, there was power in those words, okay? This bread is his body, this wine is his blood. I can't explain that, but I believed it. That moment I knew this was real. And I've thought about that since then, and I've turned it over and over and over in my head, trying to make sense of this. And I've realized that, if Jesus was being metaphorical, if he was speaking metaphorically and he was trying to say this bread represents my body or this wine represents my blood, why would he use the bread and wine? Why not talk about the lamb? The lamb, after all, was pointing forward to him all those years. Why not say this lamb is my body, this lamb's blood is my blood? But instead he used bread and wine as if he wanted something simple, something that all people of all time going forward could get their hands on, so that again and again they could take hold of this reality that he was giving. So that with something as easy as bread, they could receive his body, the body that just a few hours later would be beaten and whipped and crucified. So that with something as easy as wine, they would be able to receive his blood, which in just a few hours would be poured out for forgiveness. And I can't explain to you how it is that bread can be his body. I can't explain to you how wine could be his blood. I can't explain the miracle of all of this. All I can tell you is that Jesus said it. I believe it. That's all there is to it. Ever since then, ever since that night, I've been a follower of Jesus. And I've been gathering with other followers of Jesus, and I've been eating the bread and drinking the wine, and I've been remembering, not that God brought us out of slavery in Egypt. That was important, but compared to this, sin has a price. Redemption is costly. Jesus paid that price so that we would be redeemed, so that we would have freedom from sin, and from death, and from despair, so that we would have hope and a future. In Egypt, God gave us a sacrifice to redeem our firstborn sons. But on the cross, God gave his firstborn son as a sacrifice to redeem all of us, so that we would have a future. And then Jesus gives us this meal, bread and wine, so that we can take hold of that redemption again and again and again. So, why do I, a Jewish man, no longer celebrate the Passover? It's because the Passover was just a shadow. It was just a symbol pointing forward to the greater sacrifice of Jesus. It was just a sign that sin has a price, that redemption is costly, but that God pays that price for us. We don't need the old Passover anymore. This is our Passover. His body, his blood, given to us for our forgiveness, for our redemption, for our freedom. That's good enough.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Timeless Truths. Whether you're a first-time listener or a long-time listener, we're glad you could join us. For more information or to support the work of St. Mark Ministries, check out our website at stmarkministries.com. Be sure to tune in next episode as we continue our series, His Final Steps. And remember, you matter and you are loved.